This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Not that every other day hasn't been, but today's a busy one. Here's what we've got. We see the signs of the pandemic's unprecedented economic blow to the US economy. Plus, we'll talk about how the Save Our Stages movement is working to preserve independent music venues across the country. But first, here's what you need to know right now. The nation's COVID-19 death toll is climbing, and as a sign of how bad things have gotten, the US now accounts for 1/5 of all deaths from the virus worldwide. Despite COVID case numbers falling in some parts of the US, hospitalizations remain high across hotspots like Florida and Texas, and public health experts are telling Americans to keep their guard and their masks up. One casualty of COVID today is Herman Cain, a businessman and former presidential candidate. He died at age 74, almost a month after being hospitalized with complications from the virus. Cain ran for president as a Republican nominee ahead of the 2012 election. He dropped out in 2011 as sexual assault allegations surfaced, but not before unveiling his memorable and memeable 999 tax plan. The former CEO of Godfather's Pizza tested positive for COVID-19 on June 29th. That was 9 days after Cain attended President Trump's rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And a giant of the civil rights era was laid to rest today as family, friends, 3 US presidents, and thousands of admirers mourned the passing of John Lewis. In an essay John Lewis wrote shortly before his death and published today by the New York Times, the late congressman urged people to stand up for democratic causes. And in eulogizing John Lewis, President Obama didn't hold back in calling out measures that make it tougher to vote, especially for minority voters.
We may no longer have to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar in order to cast a ballot. But even as we sit here, there are those in power who are doing their darndest to discourage people from voting by closing polling locations and targeting minorities and students with restrictive ID laws and attacking our voting rights with surgical precision, even undermining the Postal Service in the run-up to an election that's going to be dependent on mail-in ballots so people don't get sick.
In a series of tweets today, the president suggested delaying the November election and called mail-in voting, quote, inaccurate and fraudulent. So we looked into some of his claims, and here's what we found. Turned out delaying the election isn't actually up to him. The power lies with Congress. That means both the House and Senate would need to approve any decision to delay. If that happened, and that's a big if, Trump's term would still officially expire on January 20th, 2021, according to the US Constitution. Also, there's no evidence of widespread fraud in mail-in voting, and that's been proven by one study after another. To make a point here, a 2017 study only found fraudulent activity in 0.00004 to 0.00009% of mail-in voter ballots. That's a pretty small number, y'all. It's no secret that the US economy struggled under the weight of the coronavirus, and today we found out just how bad it's gotten. The stock market dropped more than 200 points today, while the GDP saw a record-breaking contraction. Those aren't the only metrics that matter, but they are signs of the pandemic's heavy toll on the US economy. Newsy's Bianca Fascini breaks this down even further and gives us a glimpse at what this means for Americans.
The U.S. economy shrank by an annual rate of 32.9% from April to June, and the worst plunge we've seen since the 1940s. The second quarter report of gross domestic product, the total goods and services produced in the U.S., is the latest data highlighting the scope of the pandemic's economic devastation. It comes as the Labor Department reports another 1.4 million Americans filed jobless claims last week, a minor increase from the week prior.
The U.S. economy is 75% consumption, which means we are what we spend. And if we are what we spend, we only can spend what we're making in our jobs.
A recent spike in new COVID-19 cases has economists worried about what lies ahead. On Wednesday, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell warned the surge is weighing on growth.
A full recovery is unlikely until people are confident that it's safe to re-engage in a broad range of activities.
The GDP losses weren't quite as bad as they were expected to be, but the decline is nearly 7 times higher than the drop seen in the first quarter of the year. Bianca Fascini, Newsy, Washington.
When you're back, we'll offer up some pearl-clutching numbers that you won't see anywhere else.
every patient was a dollar sign. It wasn't about how well was the treatment done, it was about how much did you make on that treatment.
On a personal basis, I've watched them drilling perfectly healthy teeth.
I do not think I was an aggressive dentist.
Losing your perfectly healthy teeth. How dare you try to do that to me?
We're not really sure that Wall Street is the best place to make medical decisions for us.
Nothing's wrong with making money if you're doing it ethically. Absolutely not.
Every so often, we partner with the good folks over at Ipsos to survey Americans on a wide range of issues. Our latest survey turned up some pretty fascinating findings. Here's what we've got. 69% of Americans say they would be interested in taking an FDA-approved vaccine for COVID-19, which is good, until you see 25% of people say they would not be interested in taking an approved vaccine. Public health experts say a vaccine is the only thing that will really get us back to any kind of normalcy, but huge swaths of the country could still be in danger from the virus if there's a lot of people walking around without having taken a vaccine. In an exclusive interview today, Newsy spoke with Dr. Deborah Birx, who's heading up the White House's coronavirus task force, and we asked her about what we found in our survey.
I think having that many say that now, when they haven't seen the efficacy and the safety profile yet, just tells me that that's our starting point. And as we get out information on how effective the vaccines are and how safe the vaccines are, that says that number is only going to go up from there.
Here's a wild one. 23% of Americans say they would support President Trump staying in office even if he were to lose the election. Among Republicans, more people actually support Trump staying in office, even if he loses, than oppose it. Kind of a high number considering there's no legal reasoning or historical precedent for a US president staying in office after losing an election. So yeah, let's hope it doesn't come to that. And 62% of women say they would be the parent handling childcare if schools are at least partially online this fall and children are left at home. That's compared to only about 1 in 4 men who say they would be the one mainly taking care of children. It might not be surprising, but it does confirm a serious gender gap in the impacts of the pandemic era. Remember in-person concerts? One of my hopes is that when this pandemic is over, I'll be able to hit my favorite music venues all over again. But many independent venues have been some of the hardest hit businesses. As Newsy's Casey Mendoza reports, one movement is pushing lawmakers to help save the stages where musicians perform.
What are some of your favorite music venues across the country?
Joe's Live, House of Blues.
930 Club in Washington, D.C. is one of my all-time favorites.
I'm standing on my favorite venue, which is at Fitzgerald's nightclub.
Independent music venues are some of the hardest hit businesses during the pandemic. As the first to close and last to open, many in the music industry are worried about whether their stages can survive the lengthy closures, continuing expenses, and massive revenue losses.
There's a lot of just legendary venues that are really in danger right now. You know, like places that like Nirvana played and the Ramones played.
The biggest question I get is, what are you going to do? And I've tried to answer that question for months with some type of creative response, but the reality is that there's not much we can do besides sit and wait.
We did a survey of NEVA members a couple of months ago and found that if the shutdown lasts 6 months or longer and there's no significant federal help, 90% of NEVA members said that they will go out of business entirely.
NEVA is the National Independent Venue Association, and it's lobbying lawmakers with the Save Our Stages movement to establish grant programs and tax credits for struggling venues unable to survive on existing small business support programs. As a national organization, NEVA is unprecedented itself.
This association didn't even exist until the pandemic. And now we have 2,000 members, venues across the country in all 50 states and Washington, D.C.
The movement is finding support from both sides of the aisle, and that's because the issue affects local economies as much as it does the music industry. Last year, a survey from the Chicago Loop Alliance found that each dollar spent on a ticket generated another $12 for local businesses. Outside of the US, the UK government has already approved almost $3 million to support English music venues and nightclubs, meaning individual businesses can receive between $1,200 and $100,000 in emergency relief until September. In the US, it's still unclear if federal financial support will be approved in time, and as the pandemic continues, that pressure rides on top of the uncertainty of when venues can reopen at all.
I think every musician at this point has sort of had the thoughts of like, will I ever play a show again?
There is no end in sight currently. So these call to actions are very important for our patrons and our venues and our artists.
Casey Mendoza, Newsy, Chicago.
Stop me if you've heard this one before, but here's a tune I think you'll like. It's called Hit Us Up on Twitter using the hashtag Newsy in the Loop. It goes a little like this.
Sure. Memes and cat videos are fun, but actual news might be a bit more useful. Follow Newsy on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get straightforward, opinion-free news right on your social news feed.
Imprisoned in state and federal facilities have been released ahead of schedule. In our new Newsy documentary, Early Release, we follow one man's journey as he gets reacclimated to being on the outside during the pandemic. Here's a clip.
I remember seeing prison for the first time. It just comes out of nowhere. It like cuts across the landscape, especially in Colorado where we just have beautiful natural things everywhere. Just to see a giant gray building surrounded by sharp metal wire is strange. It's surreal. It's like something out of a science fiction movie. Ultimately, there's nothing any prison can do to contain a virus. There's a lot of at-risk people in the prison system, and because of the way prisons are set up, everybody lives on top of each other. And the idea of social distancing in a prison is ridiculous. I remember at one point counting 7 people in my immediate living area that probably would have died just because of their health.
Thank you for using Global Tel Link.
Is it you?
Hey!
Hey!
Sister!
How you be?
I'm okay. I'm alive.
PJ, he's one of 150 inmates in the state of Colorado, which has 16,000 total, to be released early due to COVID-19. So he was supposed to see parole in late May, and then his mandatory release date was later in August. So he's getting released a few months early. They're releasing people early during the crisis because it's virtually impossible to social distance in prison. PJ described it as there's 150 men in a single pod. You know, you have maybe 3 square feet to yourself at any given time. So they've had outbreaks in Sterling, outbreaks in Buena Vista. They're trying to do what they can to mitigate before it becomes something that's hard to control.
Early Release is available wherever you watch Newsy, or if you can't wait, you can check it out as soon as we wrap things up. Now, we mentioned earlier that public health experts say a vaccine is the only thing that will get us back to some kind of normalcy that looks more like the world pre-COVID. But while that vaccine is still a ways off, the good news is that a few candidates are in the testing phase. Newsy's Lindsay Thies has more.
And a little feeling of pressure.
The biggest COVID-19 vaccine study is underway. This week, researchers began testing 30,000 test subjects in the NIH's and drug maker Moderna's phase 3 clinical trials. What can those test subjects expect? Ask Neil Browning.
I feel like it's my duty.
Browning was part of Moderna's phase 1 COVID vaccine trial. In March, he rolled up his sleeve as one of 45 original participants.
What made you want to participate in this trial?
Well, I felt that the risks seemed minimal compared to all the research and the data that I was given and the questions that I had asked and had answered, coupled with discussing it with my fiance and mom, who are both in the medical industry.
In that initial study, researchers tested the shot on healthy participants to make sure what dose is safe and doesn't have serious side effects. From there, the drug makers' next phases of clinical trials test more people to learn more about side effects in other age groups.
It's probably one of the reasons this is a 2-dose vaccine, because we clearly want to protect older people and people who are frail with chronic underlying illnesses. Very important that the vaccine work in those populations.
If someone signs up and participates, they will be tested at one of 89 clinical sites across the U.S. and will receive 2 shots, the initial vaccine and then a booster 28 days later. It will be either a placebo or will include a 100 microgram dose of something called messenger RNA.
They take normal human cells that would normally be produced in my body, and the RNA is given a set of instructions to that handful of cells to build spike proteins on the outside of the cell when it's made to mimic and look just like COVID-19. The idea is the body will see this as an invader, even though it's one of my cells. It'll have an immunoresponse, and it will start learning to build T cells, antibodies, and how to surround this cell and allow white blood cells to then capture and destroy them.
Browning got 2 shots, a low dose of the initial messenger RNA vaccine and a booster 4 weeks later. He did daily symptom journaling and temperature checks and goes in for an occasional blood draw to see if there are any side effects. He's got 3 more to go. So far, he says he hasn't had any side effects.
My upper arm at the injection site was very slightly sore, but honestly, it was not nearly the soreness I felt before in getting other immunizations and flu shots.
The Moderna NIH vaccine is one of 25 in clinical trials around the world. Some experts anticipate if everything goes right, the results of these Moderna trials would come out sometime in the first quarter of 2021, which differs from the NIH's timeline of having a vaccine by the end of 2020. Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
A few more ads and then we will be reunited once more, my friends.
Getting caught up on the news needs to work with your schedule, and Newsy has you covered. Download our streaming app for Roku and Amazon Fire TV to get up to speed with the biggest stories of the day. Newsy, be informed, not influenced.
As we close in on the start of the school year, many parents are likely weighing whether to send their children back to school in the middle of a pandemic. In this next story, Newsy's Patrick Terpstra looked into school reopening plans across the country and found big differences in how schools plan to handle COVID in the classroom.
Decide which 4 questions you're going to do.
What happens when a teacher or student gets the coronavirus at a reopened school? It's a crucial question for parents and for educators considering whether to go back to a classroom this fall.
How are we going to handle when a student gets it, if they turn for the worst and possibly death? And how do we take care of the employees with the same situation?
We found school districts coming up with different plans for how to respond to a confirmed case of the virus. Dayton, Ohio announced a plan to close an entire school for up to 4 weeks if a student tests positive. Plus, shutter the schools of those students' relatives if they live in the same home.
Parents will be notified immediately, and online learning will begin the next school day.
Albuquerque, New Mexico plans to close a school long enough for it to be fully sanitized. Other districts will work with local health departments to figure out what to do case by case.
Why are districts coming up with so many different kinds of plans?
The guidance from our leadership nationally and at the state level has tended to change.
The CDC advises teachers and students in the same cohort or group to self-quarantine if one tests positive. Those recommendations came out just last week.
The guidance that we've gotten so far has changed. It has not been consistent, and it has not felt trustworthy enough for people to feel like this is final.
Some school systems, including those in South Florida, are still deciding how they'll handle an infection.
There will be a solid plan, but nothing is foolproof with this virus.
Broward County, Florida, among many districts with time to weigh the risks of face-to-face learning, planning to start the year almost entirely online. Patrick Terpstra, Newsy, Washington.
So a lot of parents are feeling a little uneasy about sending kids back to school this fall. Enter micro school. Reporter Alicia Nieves looks at how some parents are taking a different kind of approach to education in this strange time.
On March 13th, our kids jumped off the bus all together. There's 9 of them in our neighborhood. They had 2 weeks off, but that turned into the rest of the school year.
Jennifer Quadrosi in North Andover, Massachusetts, and her 7-year-old daughter spent the end of the school year and all summer social distancing with a group of parents and kids in their community.
We call ourselves kind of the bubble.
To keep her daughter still protected in their bubble, she has become one of many parents around the country considering microschooling for the upcoming school year.
Right now, there are 3 families that are considering it, and that age range would be from 1st grade to 3rd grade. And we would follow the curriculum that was developed by our community and our schools.
With microschooling, a few families joined together to create a homeschooling pod. Quadrosi's playroom will become their pod's classroom.
But we're going to line up desks along this area.
And they'll likely pay an educational facilitator to teach the children.
That could be anyone from a retired teacher to a teacher's aide or a teacher that got laid off.
One of the concerns around homeschooling pods is that there are many parents who can't afford to pay someone else to teach their kids. But there are some parents who are finding a way to make homeschooling pods more affordable.
I am a stay-at-home mom, and I'm very fortunate to be able to do that, and I realize not everyone is. But the other parents that are in this pod are working parents.
Gintel La Rochelle's pod has each parent teaching their group of 5 kids 1 day a week, making it more cost-effective and freeing up time for some parents to work.
If this is something that parents really want to do, the options are there for them. It just takes a little bit of creativity.
Pods can be formed organically with your friends and family, or there are Facebook groups now forming in almost every state around the country where parents are making connections. These 2 moms have learned, though, the key to creating a pod is starting your search early. You'll need time to talk with other parents that may be in your group about mostly creating a new set of rules or pact for your pod, especially around social distancing outside the created classroom. Because the main reason for microschooling is to give kids some socialization while reducing their health risks.
My genuine hope is that this is just a 1-year thing.
I'm Alicia Nieves reporting.
Was it just me, or was that a lot of news tonight? If you made it through this whole show, congratulations. You're now a platinum level In the Loop viewer. We'll be back Monday night, same time, same place.